The sound of hip-hop has not only changed sonically, but it has also revamped the sound of rap music globally. In the earlier years of hip-hop, the genre itself was dominated by heavyweight giants such as Rakim and Big Daddy Kane. The South was also active when it came to the emergence of hip-hop, even though the spotlight was not as notable as the East Coast. But nonetheless, with acts such as Danny Renee and the Charisma Crew, The Flame and the Dynamite 3, G-Man MC, Shy D, the Rapping Lords, and most notable 2 Live Crew, the South was able to at least step into the arena as hip-hop began to spread in popularity within the inner cities across the nation. As the climate in hip-hop began to change to become even more commercialized and at times salacious, the South began producing acts such as Organized Noise, Goody Mob, and of course Outkast. Outkast was one of the more vocal Southern acts to assert their staying power within hip-hop. Andre 3 Stacks even went as far to vocalize his agitation with how Southern rappers were being perceived, treated, and even mocked at times by their East Coast peers. And from then on, a plethora of Southern hip-hop acts began to become more and more visible on the Billboard charts. Notable acts such as Scarface, Ludacris, UGK, Master P were ushering a wave of Southern hospitality. Even though these acts were coming from the same region, the sounds were different in many ways. Scarface opted for more somber, extremely descriptive street tales, which to this day, Scarface is still one of the more underrated acts in hip-hop. UGK, on the other hand, in many regards remained a powerhouse and a fixture within the South, being able to keep soulful, syrupy instrumentation alongside with excellent synergy that few were able to duplicate. Master P and No Limit brought the bounce, and one of the more innovative concepts that No Limit relied on was the idea of independence. What most Southern rappers were able to do that many of their contemporaries in other regions were not able to do so was rely heavily on the independent route. Southern rap was becoming more and more mainstream by the time of the No Limit era and rolling into the Little John era, and Ludacris proclaiming himself as a dominant fixture in the South. Ludacris was able to inject humor back into hip-hop lyrics, a trait which for the most part was forgotten by many A-list mainstream rappers. The only other rappers at the time that were keeping humor and comedy in their lyrics were Eminem and Redman. Ludacris had a quick tongue delivery, a penchant for witty lyrics, and a boisterous voice, all the while destroying the previous notion that Southern rappers outside of Outkast and Goody Mob could not rap. Ludacris even enlisted the assistance of Organized Noise on his major debut album Back for the First Time. The album ended up selling over 3.1 million copies. Ludacris ended up dominating the Southern scene as an undisputed king of the South for about 3 to 4 years, with the release of several commercially successful albums: Back for the First Time, Word of Mouth, Chicken and Beer, and the Red Light District, before a new contender entered for the throne of the South. T.I.'s introduction to the rap game was the beginning of a new era and subgenre in rap music. T.I. released his debut album, I'm Serious, on October 9th, 2001. T.I.'s debut album, unlike Ludacris, was not a commercial success. In fact, the album to date has only sold 268,000 copies, making it T.I.'s lowest selling album. But T.I. was able to bounce back with the commercially and critically successful album Trap Music on August 19th of 2003. T.I. continued until he was able to drop Urban Legend and was able to garner more traction as a solid contender for HNIC of the South with singles like Bring 'Em Out and You Don't Know Me. The album that pushed T.I. directly into the mainstream was King. Also, Tip had the opportunity to display his acting in the film ATL, which some of the tracks from the King album were featured on the soundtrack, pushing the album to sell more than 500,000 copies in its first week. T.I. also began proclaiming himself King of the South, which was at the time a bold statement considering the array of talent running throughout the South at the time. For the most part, few rappers directly responded to T.I.'s assertion to the throne of the South. There was one rapper from Houston who felt that the Hotlanta rapper was a little out of pocket with his claim as King of the South. The battle between Lil Flip and T.I. was the first battle of its kind pertaining to any type of throne within the South. The battle between Flip and Tip, in a sense, was a throwback to the classic style of battling that was prevalent in the East. Tip was able to assert his lyrical domination with several humorous tracks, including its spin on Jay-Z's 99 Problems. Flip eventually began to lose footing in the mainstream due to the regressive musical content that was seen as somewhat becoming gimmicky. T.I. continued to spark with peers in the industry, including Indirect and Subliminals, with 50 Cent. In fact, the apex of one of the more notable battles in the South was kind of Don King in a sense by one of 50 Cent's G-Unit soldiers, Young Buck, with the track Stump. The original track featured a verse from Tip taking shots at Ludacris. Ludacris heard the verse from the self-proclaimed king of the South and promptly responded on the very same song. This moment was reminiscent of LL Cool J dissing Cannabis on the very same track that they both were recording on. For the album release of the cut, Tip's verse was eventually removed and replaced with a verse from The Game. However, Ludacris's verse did remain on the cut. While Tip and Luda continued to take indirect and subliminal shots at each other on various tracks, a subgenre within rap music was quietly growing in the city of Atlanta called trap music. Trap music was a style of rap music that focused more on the dope dealing side of street narratives. To be fair, rappers have always talked about dope dealing in rap music, from NWA to Curtis Blow to Biggie Smalls, but with trap music, the dope dealing tales and instrumentals were a little grittier. Even though Tip brought an aspect of trap music to the mainstream, it was Jeezy who arrived on the scene with a slightly revamped sound for trap music, the subgenre that is. From I'm Serious to King, even though Tip lyrically illustrated complex narratives about the trapping lifestyle, for the most part his instrumental selection, however, was tailored more for mainstream listeners. Young Jeezy had been making noise on the underground circuit in Atlanta since 1998. In the early half of his career, Jeezy was vocally being compared to Trick Daddy, which Jeezy did cite as an influence of his later on in interviews. Jeezy was able to release a joint album with Jody Breeze, Gorilla Zoe, Big G, and Big Duke called Boys in the Hood. From the way the members of the group flowed over tracks to the subject matter to even the visuals in their videos, at times, whether intentionally or not, they were evoking the spirit of NWA. Jeezy was, however, able to continue on with a solo career with the release of Thug Motivation. Thug Motivation was on the grittier side of trap music sound-wise compared to T.I.'s second album called Trap Music. This, of course, was having to do with the production of Shawty Redd, Drummer Boy, Don Cannon, and Nitty. The sound of Thug Motivation would be the sound of the next level of trap music, and it would eventually spill its way into other regions of the nation. Producers such as Shawty Redd, Drummer Boy, Don Cannon, Nitty, Zaytoven, and Lex Luger are largely uncredited for reshaping the sound of Southern music, whereas previous producers in the South such as Organized Noise and Jazzy Faye and N.O. Joe of UGK carried on the more traditional surfy sound. Shawty Redd, Drummer Boy, Don Cannon, Nitty, Zaytoven, and also Lex Luger brought a sound to the South that at times sounded sinister over hard bass lines, somewhat reminiscent of 3 6 Mafia's production. So Gucci Mane had always been in a weird space throughout his career. He never really had the commercial success of his Southern counterparts such as Ludacris, T.I., or even Young Jeezy, but for the most part, what was eventually preceding Gucci Mane was his reputation. To be honest with you, Gucci Mane has spent most of his career being arrested and released from jail, arrested and released from jail. And in the public's eye, it was actually celebrated. His most recent album release, Everybody Looking, is his highest chart-topping album of his career. But there was something interesting that did take place with Gucci Mane. After being arrested, after being initially charged for murder, and then being released, being able to beat the case, moving forward through his career, people were looking at him as the gangster. He's the gangster. He's a quote-unquote real nigga. Now he had been released from jail this last time, and he had lost weight. And he seemed to be a little bit more animated in his interviews and his videos you see floating around on the internet. And Gucci Mane also stated that he would like to make a change in his life. Now people are not perceiving him as the Gucci that they had become familiar with. He's no longer seen as the threatening gangster now. What is interesting is those who had really understood who Gucci was initially, he's basically returning back to who he was personality-wise when he dropped I'm So Icy, when he started out in Atlanta, when he started out around 2001 and 2002. So it is interesting to see how the public's perception has changed based on Gucci Mane seeking some sort of higher enlightenment in his life, that is. But he was able to still, for the most part, have a huge influence during that time. He was able to garner a lot of steam and was celebrated for basically looking like a beast to the general public. And his menacing tattoos all over his face, the way he carried himself, the way he looked in the face with his tattoos on his face was far more different than what Lil Wayne was doing. Lil Wayne did have a huge effect on the cosmetic appearance of the average Southern rapper. Not even just that, just rappers in general now. But what was strange about Gucci Mane, there was something grimacing about him. And it was that level and that energy that made him such an appealing figure within the South. So what you can say about the South, for the most part, it had went through several transformations, that I didn't necessarily get a chance to touch on all in this video. But what you can state though, from the NO bounce of Master P and the No Limit Soldier Squad, to the high octane energy of Pastor Troy, to the even higher octane energy of Lil Jon and the East Side Boys, to where Ludacris was actually being birthed out of that crunk era and taking the South in a different direction and making lyricism a staple, just like Outkast did years before him, and what T.I. was able to do off that energy, whereas rappers in the South, particularly Atlanta, were being taken upon and looked at as possible contenders for any throne anywhere. T.I. was able to build upon that with introspective, complex narratives about the lifestyle of what it means to be in the trap. And then Jeezy was able to take that energy from what was in the trap and make it more menacing in a sense, and also bring in an era of dark sounding trap music and dark sounding trap instrumentation, which we are still using today, even where it has been offshoot into drill music, that is. And then also what Gucci Mane was able to do was bring in the grimacing energy, that dark energy that is heavily celebrated in hip hop and rap music for the most part. He was quote unquote a real nigga, the realest nigga in the South for the longest. So of course I didn't get a chance to touch on all of the acts within the South. I will be doing so in the future. I will be working on a video about Pastor Troy and his influence, and also Lil Jon, and even Scarface, that is. This is your boy Prince Solomon. I do appreciate you for watching the video. Thank you. Continue to subscribe, and I am out. One.